Hi, so my name is Rebecca Ballard. The official title is Director of Research Compliance and Export Control Officer. I live in Faculty Center just behind the Starbucks. And what our office does is help guide you through the regulations related to research compliance, whether it's human subjects, which is the Institutional Review Board, animals, which is IACUC, and then biohazards, which is IBC. Today we're going to kind of have a little bit of a narrow focus, as you're probably planning a human subjects research study in your near future, and look at informed consent. Informed consent is a big component of your human subjects research. It's one thing that you'll spend a lot of time on. It's also one thing that the IRB will ask a lot of questions about. But we'll use a couple of terms, so if I use any acronyms or terms that you're not familiar with, please raise your hand. I try to define them, but we're regulated by government, so we get lots of acronyms. And so the first term I will introduce on our slide is this thing called the Revised Common Rule. So the Common Rule we lovingly refer to as our regulations. It's sort of the nickname. And the reason why it's common is because DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, created the regulations, and other agencies did a me too. And so other agencies sign on to 45 CFR and adopted that version. So it's common among many of our agencies that regulate human subjects. So that's why it gets the nickname, the Common Rule. And it's revised because for the first time since the 80s, it's being changed. And so we're going to have a little bit of now and later in this presentation because we're getting ready to implement that revision in January of 2019 when it goes into effect. So our templates and everything related to informed consent has already been updated to reflect these changes, so you're already, if you use our templates, going to be in line with the new rule. So that's why we call it the Revised Common Rule. All right. Let's go through informed consent. So I'm going to give you a general overview of that and the process, a little bit of the changes to the form. We're going to look at that format because it's different, and as you're going to be drafting a consent form possibly, you want to know what this means and how and strategies to draft them. And then if we have time, depending on how far along we get, we'll get to waivers. Okay? So the first thing is informed consent. There's two sort of general types, and we're going to focus on informed consent general. You might hear the term use of a short form. That's often used when you're enrolling non-English speaking persons. They get a short form in their own language, and then you use an interpreter to talk about. So it's a very specific area that you would use a short form. Everyone goes, ooh, I want the short form. It's a very limited circumstance, but it is an option if you're doing any research involving non-English speaking persons. And then if we get to it, you have two types of waivers, which we'll talk about. So the informed consent requirements, we start from the beginning. Okay, so I happen to be a scientist gone lawyer with a background in bioethics, and lawyers love certain words. We just do. It's part of our DNA. And the shall word is a word that we really like. We like shall, may, and must, and that means something very specific. So when our regulators give us this, an investigator shall obtain legally effective informed consent, it means they mean it. It's like thou shall, right? It's the bedrock. So when you see that kind of word shall, it's got a little oomph in the regulations. So we start with this premise. Thou shall get informed consent. Okay? So that's where the IRB is going to start off. Tell us your informed consent. Tell us your plan. How are you going to get it? It's only later do you get to the waivers. That's an exception to this major rule. But we start with the premise that we want to see you get informed consent. So thou shalt get it. Thou shalt document it, right? So informed consent shall be documented by the use of a written informed consent form approved by the IRB and signed. This includes an electronic format, so we've gotten all tech savvy in the IRB world. There are things that you can do for e-consents. If you're going to plan to do e-consent, come talk to me because there's some regulations around that to make sure that your handwritten paper signature is the same legally effectiveness as if you e-sign like on your phone or iPad or anything. So there's some nuances to that component, but we do allow, the regulations have provisions for doing e-documented signatures. We call that e-consent. Okay, and then the last part is, in seeking informed consent, the required information shall be provided to the subject. So obviously, you got to tell them what you're doing, right? You got to go through that consent process. So those are the three shalls. Now, this is a flaw in my profession, I will say. This is my personal opinion. We focus a lot on the document, right? So you're going to give us a document, we're going to redline the document, and you're going to edit the document, and then we're going to keep talking about the elements in the document. When we monitor you, we're going to ask for the document, we're going to look at it, we're going to say what you did wrong on the document. It's a lot of focus on the document. The reason for that is, well, it's very easy to audit a document. It either is there and signed or it's not. It either has the required elements or it's not. So it's very easy for us to monitor and audit. We're not going to be in the room when you talk to the participants. So what we can't really monitor is the consent process. But I would argue, ethically, the process is more important than the document. It's how you communicate, it's what you communicate, it's where you communicate. The document is just the memorialization of that moment, right? So I will say we focus on the document, but really the essence is a consent process. And we're going to talk about the process in greater detail, but it's something to think about, that rather than an endpoint, the consent document should be the basis for a meaningful exchange of information between you, the researcher, and your potential subject. And so we got to define what that meaningful exchange is about and how we might go about making sure that we have a true consent process, right? So when they give us elements of a meaningful exchange, these are our 5 elements. We're going to walk through in detail of each one. The first one is a sufficient opportunity to consider whether or not to participate in your research. We want to do it under circumstances that's going to minimize the potential for coercion. Going to do it in a language that's understandable for them. That's always good. They got to be able to read it, right? An adequate opportunity to read the consent document, and finally, that a copy of that signed and dated consent form is given. So let's look at sufficient opportunity. So lawyers love defining words. Sufficient opportunity is actually the language in the reg, but what does that mean? Right? What is sufficient and what is not? Is 5 minutes sufficient? Maybe not. What about 2 hours? What about 5 hours? So how do we decide? Where do we draw the line? And so the good news is the regulations do not give us a specific time point, because that would leave us with no flexibility. Instead, they say the amount of time allotted for the process of the consent is dependent on the nature and complexity of the research and the need to minimize the possibility of coercion, undue influence. So the sufficientness would look very different of a minimal risk survey study than a long drawn out cancer trial for, let's say, normal volunteers, right? That's going to change. It might look very different. Maybe 5 minutes is okay when you're doing research and this research is going to help someone, so there's a pretty good evidence of a direct benefit, and you're rushing them off to emergency surgery. Okay? We got to get you in. Hey, are you going to participate? But we got to get you into surgery because that's your best interest. Now, after the surgery, we're going to go back, give you more time to talk about that research study, about what happened in surgery, and then you can choose to withdraw your data or not, or continue to participate or not. But in that circumstance, 5 minutes might be okay. So it really depends on the circumstances, and that's part of what the IRB does, is evaluate and weigh those things about what's sufficient and what's not. Also looking at the population. So the population is going to determine what's sufficient. Okay. If the population is very sick, right, it's a very high risk study, you might need more. If they're one of our vulnerable populations, maybe it involves children, terminally ill, right? Persons who don't speak English, that you might need more time than you would in a different circumstance where you share the language. So it also depends on the population that you're enrolling. So that's something to think about. It's something that it's your responsibility as an investigator to decide, right? So while the IRB may approve your consent process, we're going to trust that you're going to go out, and if you're sitting in front of a particular person, it's your job to pick up on those cues. They're not comfortable. Maybe they can't answer the questions that you ask back when you do a teach back method of, do you understand what I'm saying? Tell me what I just repeated to you. And they're like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't make the decisions in my family. I talk to my husband. Time out. Maybe that means that person needs more time to take the consent home and go talk with their family members and then come back another day. Okay, that does delay research. But it's your job as an investigator to pick up on those cues, okay? And so if you see someone who's uncomfortable or anxious, give them more space than you would normally give them, right? Give them that sufficient opportunity. So it's not only by your project, it's actually by the person, and that by the person point is your responsibility. Because again, the IRB is not going to be there, okay? That's your job to make sure that you have gotten legally effective informed consent from every single person, and every single person is going to come at you in different circumstances. Okay? All right. The other part is minimizing the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Okay? And undue influence is a very subtle thing. So coercion is kind of the twisting your arm, like, you know, you have to consent, right? It's usually not the case, thank God. But undue influence is something a little bit more subtle, and something that we don't think about often, because we're used to being in our particular environment, but maybe the subjects that we're enrolling are not. So let's take a look at what that might look like. We call these vulnerabilities, and if you look on our website, there's different types of vulnerability, but we're going to look at two that are most common. So institutional vulnerability is when you're a person within a system and you're subordinate, right? So when we're talking about this coercion and undue influence, we're talking about a balance of power has been shifted by a variety of things, right? So it could be by the institution. I happen to be a supervisor. I'm not at the same decision power making as my staff, right? So the institution has made that person subordinate just because of my job title, right? We have a hierarchy. Deferential vulnerability is, again, just a little bit more subtle. There's not a formal like HR structure that we had, but it's something where there is still a difference in power, okay? And those might be hard to pick up on, but something to think about as you're recruiting. So let's take a look at a couple of relationships. What about employer and employee? Pick which one. This is the interactive part. Make sure your coffee was strong this morning. It'll fit in the institutional vulnerability, all right. Find my mouse there. Excellent. So again, you're subject to a very formal hierarchy. The institution sets it out and says, hey, HR says this person gets to make decisions based on this person, okay? And this is something, you know, if you have different teams or whatever, oh, it's no big deal. My employees know that they can tell me no. You may think that as a boss, right? But it might be very different. So I'll tell you a story about a recruitment procedure that happened at a different institution. So I was actually at a hospital, and the hospital put in place a very, very unfavorable policy. The nurses were all up in a roar. Like, it was politically like not a good decision, was the feeling. This particular nurse manager was very adamant, very outspoken against this hospital policy, okay? So she proposes to the IRB to come into staff meeting and say, okay guys, so I'm gonna be that nurse manager, you're gonna be my employees, and go, hey, I would like to get your feeling about this unfavorable hospital policy. So I'm gonna hand out the surveys, okay? So if you guys want to participate, please participate. Just hand it back to me when we're done, and I'm gonna be sitting here while you guys do the survey. So let me sit down, right, and sit in the meeting with her employees. Oh, and just a reminder, guys, don't worry. You might be getting some calendar invites from my administrative assistant because, you know, HR just reminded us that employee evaluations are due next week. Okay, you guys fill out your surveys. I'm gonna sit here. How do you feel if you're the employee?
Like you're going to get a bad evaluation if you speak against the policy.
Right. Might feel like your job might be put in jeopardy, right? So we talk about risk. We talk about lots of risks: social risk, employability risk, risk to your social reputation and harm, legal risk, right? And so this one, you might feel like that was implying, maybe totally innocently and completely inadvertently. She's just thinking, I got a calendar appointment. I got something to do. But she implied something in that statement of, oh, in your job evaluation, or even she implied something by sitting there. Okay, so now you're going to switch roles and you're going to play IRB members. Okay, how would you change that study to minimize coercion, to minimize this vulnerability?
Have someone uninvolved do the survey?
Yeah, take the supervisor out of the situation. Okay, that's the easy one, right? Remove it. Anything else? What about the location? Should we do it in our staff meeting? Because that's where the source of this power differential is about, right? So taking it out of the scenario. So you could pass out the surveys. Actually, this is how the IRB reconciled this. So the supervisor was allowed to talk about the study, pass out the surveys, and said, okay guys, so staff meeting is over. If you would like to participate, there's a locked box somewhere far, far away from my office at the front desk. And if you want to participate, it's completely anonymous, so we took away any identifiers. You just drop your survey in that box in the break room or at the front desk, far, far away where I would know, and do it whenever you want. So I could do it on my way home when my boss is not around. I could do it during my lunch break, and no one would see, and it wouldn't have my name on it. So we took it away from that environment where I'm watching you and that sort of thing. So lots of different strategies that you can do to remove that undue influence. All right, what about a doctor-patient relationship? Which one does this fit in? Institutional or deferential? Differential. Very nice. So there is the power structure, right? The white lab coat means something, and in different generations, there was a very paternalistic hospital environment. So folks like my parents, whatever the doctor says I do, I don't question it. I think now with information like WebMD, we go and seek second opinions and a lot of work on behalf of our medical field. Now that relationship dynamic is I could talk back to my doctor and he's not going to hurt me in surgery or anything, right? We can question our doctor, and I think younger generations are of that mindset a lot more, but that's something to also keep in mind. Still, it's a doctor. Like, he went to medical school. I didn't. WebMD is not always correct. So there is still, even if you're an educated consumer of our healthcare, there's still a power differential. But it's not in a hierarchy, so that's not why it's not institutional. If you don't like your doctor and what they say, or don't like how they're interacting, you can go find another doctor, right? So you get to leave that power struggle. But it is something to keep in mind. Once you put on that lab coat, you're in a position of authority. And so that can impact how people perceive the information that you're giving. Okay. So general strategies for how to reduce this coercion, because that's a big piece of it, and this really does play in and impact your informed consent process. So we're talking about the environment. First, don't choose people with institutional or deferential vulnerabilities, or any other vulnerability for that matter, just because they're convenient. Just because they're hanging around, they're accessible, right? So you might say, well, I'm going to use my fellow students in my class because, I know them and I see them every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. No, that's not convenient. If there's no scientific justification for only limiting it to that class, then you should open up your enrollment to others. Don't pick them because they're simply convenient, okay? Think about designing your recruitment strategies where the subject can initiate the contact, right? So I can come into a classroom and say, hey guys, I'm doing this research study, here's what it's all about. I'm going to pass around flyers. And if you're interested, this is who you email and this is how you get in contact, and we'll schedule a consent process and then your interview, if it's an interview study. So I'm just passing around flyers, or I'm putting up flyers in the board, maybe by Starbucks or wherever your flyer can be hung. And the subject is the one that reaches out. So it's on them to go, yeah, I'm totally interested. I'm going to call that phone number, right? I'm going to email that person. So it takes it out of your hands and puts it in your subject's hands and empowers them. So that helps reduce coercion. Okay. We talked about this one in our scenario with the supervisor. Initiate the contact outside of the environment. So take it away from the doctor-patient relationship where the doctor just told you you had cancer, and then he's going to turn around and tell you, hey, please enroll in my cancer trial. No. Let him be the doctor and say, okay, well, there's various options for clinical trials that you might want to consider. I'm going to schedule you an appointment if you're interested to go talk with my research coordinator who can explain your options. You're removing it out of that environment where we just had a very intimate doctor-patient relationship, right? Or you're moving it out of the supervisor staff meetings where we have that environment. Okay. Conducting enrollment and consent process by someone other than the person with that power dynamic. So you want someone to be at an arm's length. So the doctor in the research coordinator scenario is a good example. I may not feel like I can question my doctor, or I don't want to piss off my doctor because he's got to treat me. Like I have a vested interest in him staying happy with me. But I'm more likely to ask maybe critical questions to a research coordinator who I don't have that trusting relationship with yet. That's a total stranger. I may go, well, why are you telling me this? Like I might question her and really push her on the facts that she's given me that I might not do with my own doctor. Okay, so you want someone who's new or at an arm's length relationship, or where that trust isn't already embedded in the relationship. And then finally, and this should be across the board, the voluntary participation should be emphasized throughout the whole thing. So it says it in the consent form, that's one of your elements. You'll have to have this participation in research is voluntary, but also it's on you to have the conversation. You don't feel comfortable, please don't sign. All right, would you like to take it home? Please take it home, there's no rush. It's completely voluntary, this is your choice, right? So you got to reaffirm that, and there's never going to be an issue of overstating that it's voluntary, okay? Okay, so we go back to our list of items. Information is a language understandable subject. Now you might say, well, that's easy. Obviously, if I speak English, I need someone who speaks English, and the form needs to be in English. So obviously, if you're dealing with someone who doesn't speak English, then you need to give them the form in the language that they understand, and also give them an interpreter through the consenting process. So that adds another layer of difficulty in having more people at the party for your consenting, right? And then you have to go get that form translated. Be careful. Just because I say I speak Spanish doesn't mean I speak Spanish. Like, my husband's from Puerto Rico, I know enough to know when my mother-in-law's talking about me, and I can order us a round of margaritas. That's about it. So don't give me something in Spanish, because if you're asking higher level concepts, like I'm not going to be able to truly understand. I might pick out a few words and kind of go, yeah, I get the gist, but I'm not really truly understanding the nuances of what you're saying in that language. So be careful when you ask people, because they'll say, oh yeah, okay, I speak English. So maybe they're embarrassed, right, that they don't speak English. So think about that as you're looking at it. It's truly, they need to be completely comfortable and fluent. Or if you are bilingual, you might be more comfortable in one language or the other. And if that's the case, ask and go and seek translated forms. So that's the non-English speaking persons. It's also important because English is also a complicated, difficult language, and we want to make sure that we're at the 8th grade level. So I'm going to give you the tip. If you learn nothing else or remember anything else, this is the golden goose right here. There it is. Word checks the readability statistics inside its system. Okay, this is not an opportunity for you to prove to the IRB you speak the King's English. Okay, it's got to be language understandable. We try to target the 8th grade. Okay, 8th grade level. So if you go into File under Menu Options, there's this little Options menu has proofing, right? And there's this little button that it's a little hard to read. It says Show Readability Statistics. Click that box. Okay, and it's going to force Word to do this magic trick. It's great. You're going to check spelling, and then when you're done, when your spell check's complete, it'll give you this little pop-up. This is your readability statistics, and magically it tells you the grade level. This happens to be our template. Conveniently, 8th grade level. Okay, so if you start with a template, you're already there. Now, oftentimes then you start typing and editing in your own language, and then it goes up, 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 up. I've written thousands of consent forms in my life. Right out the gate, I'm about the 9th to 10th grade level, and I have to go through and proofread to get it back down to 8. So when you're used to being in a college-educated environment, we use bigger words. So don't say, I'm going to have you do this blah, 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 blah scale. No one knows what that is. If you participate in research, we'll ask you some questions. Okay, I got that. Right? So also think about the terminologies that you use, define them, get rid of your fancy words that you learned in college, right? You'll impress your professors, but that's not what you need for your subjects. Break it down. What are you doing? What are you asking them to do? If you participate, you'll be asked some questions. It'll be audio recorded. Okay? Keep it simple, and you'll get down to this level. But this is a good way. We run this when you submit. So we're going to do this. This is like showing you the answers to the test. If this shows up at 10, you're going to get a response back going, revise. Okay? So there's your tip. Adequate opportunity to read the consent form before signing. So this is something important to think about, because it's easy to be like, you know this. You've like said this thing 20 times because you've already recruited 20 subjects. So it's just in your head. And the more you do that, the more you skip stuff because you're feeling like a broken record, right? So your consent process for the first subject may not be as good as the 20th subject or the 100th subject. So yes, you need to verbally have that conversation, feel them out, ask them questions, but also give them time to read the consent form, okay? Then I will offer this as awareness. Not everyone can read. Actually, literacy is pretty high in the United States. And this is another area where people may be embarrassed to tell you they can't read. It's also an area where it's very hard to detect if someone, because society has said, well, you should be able to read, and so they have a lot of mechanisms to hide this. I forgot my glasses today. They're broken. So can you just describe what's in that form for me? Right? So they mask illiteracy as well. So something to keep in mind of, give them time. Okay? So think about your population. Is this going to be high in your population? And then as you approach your subjects, this could be a potential. If you find someone stalling or not wanting or giving you excuses why they can't read it, ask more questions. Okay? And then finally, after all that, a copy of the signed and dated consent form is given to the subjects. Seems awfully specific for regulators to put this in there, right? Why? Why is this important? Why is this actually written in the law that this is a requirement? What's in that consent form? It's so important that they take home with them. Put it on the fridge.
So they know how to get out of it if they need to, and who to contact.
Yes. So at the very end, there's contact information. There's a right to withdraw. So just because you get them to sign in doesn't mean your job is over on consent. They can withdraw at any time for any reason, and it's your job to make it easy. So in the consent, it'll tell you how to withdraw, right? And there's contact information. Also, what if they go home afterwards and go, you know what? Now that I think about it, I really did answer some sensitive information on that survey. Maybe I don't feel comfortable that I answered that question. Maybe I should call. Reportable events. It's your job to make sure that your subjects know that they're supposed to call you if they don't feel comfortable. And then when they call you, you coach them through, well, here's what the information is, would you like to withdraw, and here's how you withdraw. So they want you to go home with that consent form because they want you to know who to contact, right? Who else is on that form that they get to contact? So it's not just the investigators, it's the Institutional Review Board. Maybe they don't feel comfortable talking to you. That's okay. Our information, my office line is on there. So at any time they can contact the IRB. Now I don't want to put that in there to scare you. Okay, that's a good thing. Sometimes they just want to call up and verify. I've actually had that happen. Hey, this says this was approved by you guys. Was it really reviewed and approved? And we say yes, absolutely. Sometimes, actually, when I worked for a for-profit IRB, most of the complaints were, when do I get paid? The compensation part. How do I get paid, right? The check's in the mail, right? So oftentimes it's not about you, it's not about tattletaling. They may just have other questions, but it's in there to have someone independent of the investigator team for them to call and ask. Okay? So that's important for them to have and be able to remember that information, so that's why we send home the consent form. All right. So changes to the consent form. So I mentioned earlier on our rules of changing, and so one of the big changes is this notion called tiered consent. Talk about what that looks like. So our templates look a little funny because they've already been modified for this. So let's talk about why the change. Why are they making this concept of tiered consent? Along came the informed consent document, right? So that's really important. We place a lot of emphasis on this document, but there's been a critique in the field that these consent forms have really evolved into a protective mechanism. Basically, the lawyers got involved. So that little document to tell you what's going on now becomes this document because we're going to tell you about every risk under the sun, because in case you get harmed, we don't want to get sued. So I literally have reviewed consent form documents of 55 pages plus. That's a book. No one wants to read a book. This is not a chance to read War and Peace when you're signing up for a research study. So that's one of the biggest critiques, that it's evolved into this very legal thing, and it's just the most important pieces of information is just buried in all that gibberish, right? And so it reduces that consent conversation of me truly understanding, did I read all 55 pages? And even if I did, what if I didn't understand it? And it's complicated. Like, no, make it simple. And then we've had a growing body of literature reviewing these consent forms, a lot of it coming out of the healthcare field and health literacy, that they're just too lengthy, too complex, adversely affecting the ability of us to convey information effectively. So basically, we sit down people, you give them a consent form, and then you wait a while, and then you start asking questions about what they read, and they're like, oh, I just signed it. I have no idea what I signed up. Even big stuff like, did you know that a risk was death? You think they would be able to ask that, hopefully 10, 15 minutes later. So it wasn't really improving our ability to get true, effective, informed consent. Okay, so we focus and actually now put this in the regs. So this is a legal concept that's been around in the world for a long time, but now it's actually going to be in the regulation, and it's called a reasonable person. So subjects must be provided with the information that a reasonable person would want to have in order to make decisions. So this reasonable person, who is she? It's a legal fiction, right? It's if we took a human and put them on a pedestal, and like this is the person who like always has their life together. They always make the right decision in every scenario, like they got it going on, right? Anyone know that person? Anyone that person? It's hard to be that person all the time, right? But that's what we measure. So if we put this perfect human on a pedestal and said, dear perfect human, here's the research. What would you like to know? And they would spit us back an answer. So that's how the courts actually measure it, and now it's in the regs, so that's our standard. So when the IRBs are evaluating it, it's not what Dr. Oliver is an IRB member, what she would want to know. It's not what you would want to know, not what I would want to know. It's what collectively, what would a reasonable person, all of us all combined, what would we want to know in the informed consent? So it depersonalizes it, because we might be very different on what we truly want to know to make decisions. Some people are like, I don't care, I trust my doctor. Others are like, no, I really want to know if death is like a 1% chance. That's important. So this is our standard, okay? The piece about tiered consent. So basically what it did is it introduced this idea of a main body and appendices. So it changed the format. And the goal is, remember that 55-page consent form? So now that's not the case. The main body is going to include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What that reasonable person like needs to know in their face. This is the critical information. And then if I want to know more stuff, if I'm the overachiever in the room and I really want to read every single detail about what's going on in this study, I can look at the appendices and it's available to me. Right? Some people just want to know the highlight reel. Other people do need everything to make decisions. Right? And they want that, and we should provide that. So the tiered consent is simply this. It's a format change between main body and introduce the appendices. So the next question is, well, what do I stick where? Because I've got to draft this thing for the IRB, right? So let's look at some examples. A chart that shows study visits and procedures that occur at each visit. Where do we think that goes? Main body or appendices?
Appendix.
Yep. Appendix. Great. All right. A list of important risks that might be experienced if participating in the subjects. Main body. Okay. You guys got this down. But wait a minute. A list of every possible risk. So actually, if we talk about this, and this is new, this is a very new concept, so it hasn't really been beaten and put into place yet. So we'll see kind of what's going to come as an aftermath. There's got to be a research study that's so dissertation idea, free of charge. After we implement this tiered consent, is this going to improve the consenting process? We don't know yet. People are still implementing it. Risk is probably the one area that's going to be the most tricky. Okay? So sure, if I'm going to get a headache 90% of the time, stick it in the main body, right? Confidentiality is always a risk. If it's a high risk because it's sensitive, stick it in the main body. But breach of confidentiality is always there, and gosh, we all experience that. I mean, identity theft is just a part of life nowadays. Maybe that should go in the appendices, right? because we've done all this measure to protect. So how do we know? So risk is going to be one where there's going to be a battle of where it goes. You know, if it's greater than 50% of a risk, does it come here? And if it's less than here, don't know. If it's death, that's bad. But 1%, maybe it's here. So maybe there's some scale of, well, it's the severity plus the likelihood that puts it on this side versus here. And so that's something that IRB members are going to wrestle with. There's no perfect answer. This is new in the regulations. They haven't given us much guidance yet. So think about it, because what's our standard? That reasonable person again. Okay? So it's what a reasonable person would want to see in the main body versus not. Now, the feds did give us one little list, because they like to give us lists of the things that have to go. So the things that have to be in your main body. Number one, that this consent's being sought for research. Okay, that's good. Especially if you think in a clinical trial, you don't want to mix up, like, am I getting treatment or is this research? Is it proven therapy, so it's treatment, or is this unproven and I'm being enrolled in a research trial? That's a pretty important distinction. So we got to say it's research, okay? We got to say it's voluntary. Okay, that's a cornerstone of research ethics, so that makes sense. Got to say the purposes. Why are you doing it? How long should I expect to be involved? And what procedures? Okay. Reasonably foreseeable risk is how they're going to define that risk. Now, what's reasonable? Greater than 50% not. Is it a mathematical formula? Foreseeable, what's foreseeable? You know, research by its very nature is a risky endeavor. We're trying and testing something out. There are things that we don't know yet. That's why we're doing research. Einstein said if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research. So there's risk involved with just being research. So it's got to be foreseeable, but there's still risks that we don't know about. Obviously, we can't disclose those because we don't know about them. Now, it's our obligation that once we do know, we have to go back and reconsent and then tell them. Okay, so that's our moral obligation to make sure that they constantly have the most up-to-date information to continue the decision to participate in studies. Benefits that they can reasonably expect, and then alternatives. So if you're not in this research, you may do X. Now, a lot of your minimal risk study, the alternative is you don't have to participate. Like, if, you know, survey studies, there is no alternative, right? If you don't want to do research, then don't. But in a clinical trial, if you don't want to do this research procedure, then you go to standard of care treatment. Okay. If you don't want to participate in this classroom research project, then your professor will provide you an alternate classroom project where you can get credit. So you don't have to do research, you can do another classroom project. Okay. And everything goes back to our reasonable person again. What's the key information? What would that person consider and want to see in the main body versus the appendix? So that's how we're looking at drafting. So the good news is our new tiered consent has a lot of this already in the main body, and then appendices. If the appendices don't work for you, doesn't match, we have to write a consent template that goes through every type of possible research. So it's long. You just delete out the appendices that don't apply to your study. All right, so any questions about generally informed consent, a little recruitment conversation, and then changes to the consent form and this tiered consent?
Question.
Yep.
So recently I decided to change my dissertation topic.
Okay.
So I'm looking into doing an intervention with children.
Okay.
And these children are unaccompanied, or immigrant children coming from out of the country.
Okay.
So when they get here, they're not with their parents. And so they're reunified.
Right.
In that situation, do we have to, because they're children,
Yes.
is there a consent in place that we have to still get from parents, or is this something that...
So you've entered into a whole nother realm. It's actually called Subpart D. We were in Subpart A, you now move to D.
Oh.
So whenever you involve children, pregnant women, prisoners, these are regulatorily defined special vulnerable populations, there are additional requirements. So generally you have to comply with Subpart A, which is what we talked about, but also Subpart D for children. You have to prove to the IRB why it's necessary for these children to be involved. There's additional requirements for not only parental permission, but also child assent. So now you have to deal with these consent principles both at the parent level and at the child level. Okay? There are different waivers for when parents may or may not have the right to have parental permission. So for example, if one parent's deceased, can't get consent from them, that could be a reason why you would tell the IRB that you're not getting parental permission. Also the same for children. So there are different waivers for assent. If you're dealing with a 10-month-old, probably not going to be able to get their assent because of age and capacity. And so you would have to prove to the IRB when you qualify for those different versions. So that adds when you cross the threshold into minors, it adds a whole nother layer of complication. Yeah. Best advice, schedule a consult with us and we can sit down and talk about that in great detail. Because you'll have to walk through the children provisions.
Okay.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. When we get into waivers, you can use the main waivers for the parents and child, but there's other issues with kiddos that we want to walk through. All right. So we have still a good amount of time, so that's good. Any other questions before we move on? We'll get to waivers. Okay. All right, so we talked about the provision of informed consent, but lawyers love rules, but we also love exceptions to rules because that's where we make money. It's fun, right? Regulators are the same way. So there's rules and there are exceptions. So waivers are just simply that, they're exceptions, okay? So thou shalt get informed consent, that's what we talked about before, unless you qualify. The IRB has a very big obligation. They are responsible for documenting that you qualify for these waivers, okay? Because this is a ethical cornerstone that we're now granting you an exception to, okay? And there are two flavors. Waiver of documentation. So in this scenario, we're going to talk to our people. We're going to have a conversation. We're just not going to have you sign it. It's a waiver of documentation. Second scenario, second type of waiver, you don't have a conversation. That person never knows that they're enrolled in your research study. So obviously if you don't tell them, you can't get them to sign and document it. Make sense? So two different flavors. Let's talk about which one applies for different studies. So we're going to start with a waiver process. Okay, so remember this is you never have the conversation. They don't know you're in research. Okay? How many people have participated in research studies here? If you've ever been admitted to a hospital, you should probably raise your hand. Why? Hospitals do retrospective chart studies under a waiver of consent process all the time. So if you've been admitted to a hospital and you have a medical record, likely chance that someone's looked at your record without you knowing about it and enrolled you in research. How does that make you feel? Some might say, oh, all right, good. Good for us. Look, they're learning stuff about the healthcare. Great. Others may go, wait, what would they look at? Which medical record did they review? Did they know it was about me? Maybe I'm not okay with that. Right? So we all have different feelings about our desire to be research subjects. So this is important that we go through the elements of a waiver consent process because you're enrolling them in research without ever telling them that they're enrolled in research. Okay, so we take that pretty seriously. There are two ways that the IRB, per regulations, can approve a waiver of consent. Okay, so the first option is very, very limited. So chances are this is not going to apply, but it's here. It's limited in its application because the research must be conducted or subject to the approval of a state or local government, and there's public benefit or service programs. So when they want to look at state Medicaid benefits, Medicare benefits, Social Security benefits, this is where that comes into play. Very limited. This is your bread and butter. This is our most often used waiver. Okay, so the IRB may approve a consent procedure which does not have the requirement to obtain informed consent provided these things are in place. So these are the elements. This is literally the checklist that when we review your study, we're measuring your proposal against. Here they are. No more than minimal risk. Right? We don't want to enroll you in research that's greater than minimal risk without telling you. That's nice of us. That's always good. It's not going to adversely affect your rights. Could not practically be carried out without the waiver, and the subjects will be provided with additional information when applicable. So let's take a look at each. So the first is minimal risk. This is a key concept. And you're going to have to decide where you fit into this because this concept not only decides if you're eligible for a waiver, it also decides if you're eligible for what level of review. So exempt and expedited reviews can only be minimal risk studies. Everything greater than minimal risk has to go to the full committee. So that'll impact your timing. So this is a very important concept. It means the probability and magnitude of harm discovered anticipate for the researcher are not greater in and of themselves than ordinarily encountered in daily life and during performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests. Take the average Joe, right? Average Joe, there's risk out there. It's a scary world, right? We stick him out and we let him go loose. What's his average day going to be like? Well, we talked about breach of confidentiality as a risk. Average Joe could have a breach of confidentiality. Someone could hack his iPhone, right, and get at his personal data. They could do harm to him, like steal his social security number and open up and go on a spending spree on eBay. That's a normal risk of our lives, right? So we have to deal with that. So that's how the IRB measures. Are you adding any more risk to that? Well, yeah, because you're going to ask the average Joe, who is now 19, about his use of illegal drugs. You just increased his risk because what did you do to him? What did you expose him to if that information got out?
Getting in trouble with the law.
Legal risk, right? Asking a minor or anyone if they did illegal drugs. If it's a minor and you're asking about alcohol, that could violate our laws, right? So you're asking more information that maybe they would find on his iPhone, and it's sensitive information. So if you're collecting sensitive information, that's a little bit more than his average everyday risk of what might be on his iPhone. Okay. So that's how we measure. That's the analysis we're going through. Okay. Not adversely affect the rights and welfare. So this one's interesting. So this is a SAC-HARP letter that they've kind of defined this. And what they're really looking at is whether the subject population in general would object if they knew about this waiver. Whether the subject population in general would consider the waiver has a potential called adverse effects. Okay. So it requires you to know a little bit more about your subject population. And if you're recruiting out of a population that you might not be familiar with, you might have to do a little bit more education. I'll give you an example. Anyone heard of the Havasupai tribe? Okay, so perfectly fine. The university went and consented. They reached out to the university to do diabetes research. Consented, got specimens. Specimens were stored in the freezer at a university. Totally normal. Second researcher walks in and goes, ooh, specimens, and uses them with a waiver of consent. Okay, professor started talking about this research, and a young lady from that tribe was actually in the classroom and said, wait a minute, that's my tribe. Okay, for that particular population, one of their beliefs is that when you separate a part of your body, you don't pass in the afterlife. So those tissues being stored in the fridge was an issue for them. That was unique to their culture. And so they had an issue and would object to that secondary research that was ongoing with their specimens. Results in a lawsuit. The lawsuit settled for millions of dollars. Okay, so know your population. That's the moral of that story. It's a fantastic story. If you haven't read it, there's a great New York Times video about that tribe, interviewing people from the tribe, how they felt about this. They actually did a ceremony to go to the university and grab those specimens and return them back home. It was very moving, so if you are interested in that, I do highly encourage you to watch and learn more about that. Also, there's a great book related to biospecimens, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Also a really good read. Okay, so the third one, and this is the one that's going to get you. Okay, the research cannot be practically carried out without a waiver. This is the tricky one. If you fail, chances are you're going to fail this element. Okay, so here are some excuses that we've seen in protocols. It's only retrospective. Subjects are not in front of me. It's just too hard to get consent. And getting consent will lower my enrollment numbers. Okay, I didn't make these up. These are actually in OHRP letters. OHRP is the Office of Human Research Protections Program. It's a federal agency that monitors what we do. So here's what an investigator said, straight from the letter. This is only a retrospective chart review with no more than minimal risk. This is the second one saying, I'm not involving or interacting, so I should not have to get consent. Okay, this is what they said. Well, okay, that's true. The IRB approved a waiver, but failed to address all the waiver criteria for use of prospective use of controlled subjects. So that's not enough, right? It's really easy to fall into this trap because retrospective review is a type of research where often you see consent waivers. So let's take a look at an example of one. There's a retrospective review of testing scores from existing records of 100 students that are currently enrolled and will be conducted. So you get to be the IRB. Green light, thumbs up, you approve it. Thumbs down, you wouldn't. Think about all the elements that we talked about. Thumbs up, thumbs down. This doesn't work. Okay, got some thumbs up there, all right. Yes. So one might ask, well, how many, right? How many is too many? What's the magic number? Is it 100? Is it 101? Is it 200? Is it 500? Is it 1,000? The regulations doesn't give us a clear answer. It really doesn't tell us the magic numbers, and it's up to local policies. So if you don't know the answer, you don't have black and white, well, what do you do when you're submitting an IRB? Well, maybe the specimens are 50 years old, or likely they've passed or moved away. Why is it really, really, really hard? Okay, that's your obligation in your IRB application to explain. Okay, but there's a trap. This is a warning to the IRBs, and this is also a warning to you as you're writing it and giving them each of those hooks. Do not fall into the trap of just collapsing that first element, the minimal risk element, with the not practical. It could be minimal risk and still practical, right? I could be doing an interview study. I still talk to you. I could still get your consent. I should get your consent if you're in front of me. If we're staring like this, it's practical for me to tell you and get your consent. So it's still minimal risk, but it was practical. You don't get a waiver. Make sure you address each element. Number one, you're excluding out certain populations, and make sure it matches back to your study objectives. How will you contact them? And it gives you basically tips and things, and it links out to our templates, or give you lookup links. So this is a good place to start. As you're meeting with your faculty mentors, take this, fill it out, go with your faculty member and kind of walk through these questions together. It'll help you narrow down and guide that conversation so you can get to a proposal and an outline as quick as possible. It tells you, what can be in an advertisement and not. You cannot put free pizza on your recruitment flyer, right? In big bold, you have to kind of keep it all. We have recruitment flyers that have it all in there. So it tells you things you can't do. It's $1,000 if you sign up, right? Compensation, if you're going to offer compensation. So it kind of walks you through this happens to be recruitment. So take a look at those. It's just helpful to organize your thoughts and kind of methodically walk through the phases. There are FAQs. So I mentioned children. Here's all the studies enrolling children. So parents to participate, templates for parental permissions in a sense. And then at the very bottom, so there's more like a worksheet if you're consenting non-English people. There's lots of guidances. So if you know that you're recruiting economically disadvantaged persons, right? Click here. And it kind of describes the situation, and it gives you kind of some of those, obviously if they're economically, compensation's a big issue, and it kind of gives you guidance on what you can and cannot do. And talks about strategies as well. So take a look at our website. We have a lot out there. This is relatively new, but we've tried to cover all the highlights. So like an FAQ on what recruitment materials, what you need to look out for. There's a checklist. So this is literally the same checklist we use in our office to pre-review before it goes to members. So there's no surprises. You're literally given the answers to the test. Okay, you just have to go out and read about them. Decision trees on compensation. So these are all tools that if it impacts you, it kind of walks you through what you can and cannot do. Okay, so play around there. If you get stuck, then the other option, obviously your faculty member is your first line of defense. Work with them. They've been through the process themselves, so they understand what it's like to go through. If nothing else, they're a good shoulder to cry on. But the second piece is don't be afraid of us. We are just past the Starbucks, and so you can email irb@tamucc.edu and ask for a consult, a date and time. So you would sit with either myself or Anissa, and we would walk through your study and some of the questions that you might anticipate or some of the issues and help guide you through it. My only ask of you is, we're not there to design your study. Come with something. I can't tell you how to apply the regulations if I don't know what you're doing. So if you come at me with, well, I want to do research, I'm like, okay, great. What are you going to do? My answer is going to be, like, I don't know. I can't help you apply the regulations unless we have some guidance. So try to fill out the forms, go off the website, and if you do get stuck, please, 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 please reach out to us. But you got to come with something, right? So that's my only ask is come prepared, and we will help you get through the process. Yes, ma'am.
I live in San Antonio, so
Okay.
would you be able to do like...
We have WebEx.
Oh, awesome.
Yep. So just email when you say, hey, I'm in San Antonio and I can't come down, then just email in that, and we can set up and do it by WebEx. Okay, just let us know when we're scheduling. Yep. That's a good question.
I have another question.
Sure.
So I've done an IRB before and it took like 2 months to come back. So what's the time frame? Like, how long does that take?
It's a good question. So a lot of that is as much your responsibility as ours. If you come with a protocol that's very vague and we have a lot of responses, it's going to take longer. If you do the stuff and come with templates and have it, it'll be faster. Our review time also depends on the level. So greater than minimal risk, you have to go full committee. Well, we only meet once a month. So if you're full committee, that might take longer. Exempts and expediteds, less than a month, sometimes weeks. Exempts can be days. If it's a well-written protocol, it can be 2 to 3 business days. Okay. If it's not a well-written protocol, it could be 3 months. It could be 6 months. So, and it also depends on how fast we get back the responses. So we do measure our review times. We actually measure it against national average, and we are at national average most of the time. So exempts is 12 business day national average, expedites 28 days, I think, 28. And then full committee, if you are going to go and do a full committee study, just know that we only meet once a month. So plan wisely. We meet on the first Friday of the month. So that doesn't mean give us a protocol at the last week to make that month's meeting. You're going to the next month's meeting. So on our website, we also have the review schedule. So this can help you prepare if you do have to go full committee, when we need it by, because we have to close the agenda to get the information over to the members a week before they actually meet. So you walk yourself back. So let's say your target date is to have it on the November meeting. We need to receive it in October to make that meeting. Okay. Using the templates can help. Using that consult time can help. Because if we can get you in the planning stage and get you on the right path, that means a lot less back and forth. So those are things that can help reduce the review time. And then just being responsive. Take the time, we try to give our protocol feedback with not just go fix it, but why, how. We might link you to a guidance document to read more, but oftentimes when we get back responses and it goes round and round, it's because we're not reading the response. If we ask you to change the sky to blue, don't ignore it and give it back to me in gray, or don't turn it green. Oftentimes you'll also find things go back around and around because as we ask more information, then we get back more information that suddenly asks us more. It just opens up more questions. So having a good plan from the start helps a lot. So if we ask who you're recruiting and suddenly you throw in the mix, well, I'm going to add children, that adds a whole nother layer. It's going to take longer. Or what we've seen, sometimes the ones that do take longer, is you're planning it as we're reviewing it. And so I had a survey study, and then by the time 3 months later we were done, it was an interview study. That looks different. It's a whole different study. So yeah, it took a lot longer. So those are just some strategies to think about. Come in with a plan, stick with it, use those worksheets, get a consult, get that ironed in stone, and then your review process will be, things will get changed along the way as we maybe get more information or offer you different strategies like, hey, did you know you could waive the consent signature? That might make your life easier. So things might get modified, but if you have a clear understanding of your research question and what you want to do and how you're collecting that data, that can do a lot for reducing review times. Make sense? Other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you so much. Very helpful.